of a review of 100 years of protest in art. I am Sandra McCollum of Diaspora Rhythm, an August group of collectors of art of the diaspora. Our esteemed panelists today are Juarez Hawkins, Chicago artist and curator, Luis Dela Torres, a Chicago artist, and of Nomadic Art Lab, and Paul Branton, another Chicago artist. 100 years ago, we found the world reeling from the effects of an estimate of 50 million people worldwide. World War I had just ended, and black soldiers were returning to our shores to be met with organized and massive lynchings, riots, murder, and employment discrimination. There were race riots in 15 major cities, including Chicago. Perhaps it was the violence and the excess energy everyone felt that heralded in the Harlem Renaissance in a search for beauty between 1920 and 1940. Black artists explored the flowering of Black identity, the influence of slavery, and the effects of institutional racism. Juarez, could you give us a synopsis of the art and artists of the Harlem Renaissance and lead us into the 1930s in Chicago with the Chicago Black Renaissance?
So starting, just pushing way back to William Craft, and this idea that resistance really had gone as long as African Americans have been in this country. And so it may not have been like protests in the street with big signs, but there are all these really kind of quieter, maybe subtle ways that we experience protest. Here we have William Craft. He was a woodworker, and he and his wife had what I call it just passing through. He and his wife, who was really light complected, managed to pass. He passed as just a white owner, and he was her servant. And disguised that way, they managed to make their way on to freedom. So just kind of stroke. Again, these sort of subtle ways that people were going against the system, bucking the trends. Here we have Pap Singleton and another woodworker. I just mentioned these craftsmen and artisans because these guys, even during times of slavery, tended to have a little bit more access and freedom because they were skilled laborers. They were often hired out to other plantations. So as such, they often bring news home and just were, a little bit more of the eyes and ears. So Pap Singleton actually led a homesteading movement. We hear about that westward expansion and going west and so on. And so here was a Black man who suggested to other Black people that, hey, why not get away from racism? Let's get away from Jim Crow, Black codes, and let's start our own movement westward. So I do want to give a little bit of that ancestral shout out. Here we have on the Melrose Plantation, what's called African House. It's now been restored as a museum. And it's an example of the sort of the synthesis of both African and European architecture. You see the roof kind of overhangs here and sort of creates really sort of an indoor experience. Oftentimes, as many of you know, when slaves were brought to the New World, they were forbidden to utilize their traditional art form, music, drums, this sort of thing. So the fact that this house still existed when a lot of Africans were discouraged from building their own types of homes is really part of the cleverness of a woman named Marie Coin. And she was the mistress of the wealthy owner of the plantation. And she managed not only to get a house built that was reminiscent of her homeland, but also managed to secure stake and freedom for their sons together. So, and a little ancestral shout out there. But again, these ideas of people who are saying, we don't necessarily have to stand with the status quo. They're working within the limitations of their time. A lot of scholars talk about the quilt codes. You've heard about this idea that different symbols or different patterns on quilts were used to guide slaves along the Underground Railroad. And you can certainly see where the possibilities are in terms of maybe a pattern that might say, go that way, in terms of flying geese pattern, or a cabin pattern saying, here's a place where you can find sanctuary and maybe a hot meal before you have to go on your journey. One of my favorites here is a man named Dave the Potter. Those of you familiar with the Astor Gates, you may have seen him talk about Dave. He certainly has done quite a lot of work around him. And Dave Drake was owned by a man who owned a printing press in South Carolina. He also had skill as a potter. Pots like the ones you see here could easily hold 25 or more gallons of liquid or lard or beer or whatever it was you wanted to store. So again, an amazingly strong man to be able to wield all this clay. Moreover, he knew how to read and write. And so many of his pots were inscribed with little couplets, little poems that he would put on there. And so it's sort of like his way of sort of saying, well, shortly in a few years, they're going to forbid us to be able to read and write. Here I am, I can do this, and I'm going to put my little message out here. So this piece here, this little mini poem, is kind of a pondering on freedom. I wonder, where's all my relations? Where are my people who've been sold? Friendships all and everything. So even though you might have sold my people, I'm still going to be down for friendship. I'm still going to be a people kind of guy. Or here's another little meditation on freedom. The 4th of July is surely to come, to blow the fife and beat the drum. So, masses don't get to celebrate freedom, but I'm still owned. So these little subtle messages often showed up in his work until the slave rebellions became more prominent. And then after that, you don't see as many inscribed pots by Dave anymore, for obvious reasons. Moving forward, we have here Edmonia Lewis. This is a woman both of African and I believe Chippewa descent. Definitely worth a Google. And was one of the earlier graduates of Oberlin College, one of the few colleges at the time that accepted Black people. I can go on and on and on about her work as doing sculptural work for the abolitionist crowd as a way of funding her travels to Europe. She eventually went on to study in Rome. I'll highlight this one piece. She did many that both highlighted the plight of African Americans as well as her own native people. This one here is called Forever Free. So just after the end of the Civil War, here being able to sort of showcase a different way of showing that freedom. So certainly prayerful, but still very dignified. Also, too, standing out as a sculptor, to be able to carve multiple figures from a single piece of stone is an amazing technical feat in and of itself. And if you don't believe me, try taking a chisel to a rock and kind of, take on what he might have done. So a little bit of Edmonia Lewis for you here. Next up, so as we now are moving into the dawn of 20th century and into the Harlem Renaissance, who we have here is Metta Fuller. Metta is often lumped in with the Harlem Renaissance artists, when in fact she actually lived in Philadelphia. She was very interested in the work of Garvey. She was married to a Liberian doctor, Solomon Fuller. And this piece here speaks of her friendship with the likes of W.E.B. Du Bois, and definitely her increasing sensibility as a thinker, as a sculptor, and as a woman of peace. This piece here is depicting a woman named Mary Turner. Around the turn of the century, about 1910 in Valdosta, Georgia, Mary Turner's husband was lynched. Some say it was a mistaken identity. Mary Turner, who was 9 months pregnant at the time, swore out a warrant against those men who lynched their husband, and in turn, they came after her. Again, you can look, to history, the historical record, maryturner.org, to get a sense of how brutally they lynched this woman and her unborn child. So what Meta Fuller is relaying here is the dignity of a woman who's being kind of grabbed at. You see all these hands here, but in her final act on this earth is going to stop and protect her baby. So even in the midst of the craziness of lynching, the horror that filled her family, she still had that little bit of dignity. So it spoke to both Meta Fuller as a mother, but also to a silent protest that went on in New York City, in Harlem, right on the heels of this lynching. Harlem went down the street totally quiet in a parade throng and just protesting not only this lynching, but lynching in general. As we move into Harlem Renaissance, we certainly see a lot guided by the literature of the time. On the left here is Claude McKay, a man of Jamaican descent, and he wrote a book called The Blacker the Berry. He's also known for his poetry. One of my favorite poems of him starts out, it's called If We Must Die. And it says, if we must die, let it not be like dogs. So again, talking about this idea of his anti-lynching sentiment, this idea that no, we're not going to stand for you hanging us, burning us. And the last, lines deal with, we might be dying, but we're steadily fighting back, and so very militant mindset even as far back as 1920. On the right, you guys see Langston Hughes. And if you think Langston Hughes wasn't hard, you might want to read a book called The Ways of White Folks. It's a series of short stories where he makes very scathing critiques against racism and white society and its impact on Black people. But not only did he critique, the dominant culture, but he also was kind of at the vanguard of the Harlem Renaissance. You got Locke and Du Bois and sort of that old school. Langston Hughes was coming in as part of the new school, whereas the old school was saying to Europe or even look to Africa as a source of cultural inspiration. Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston and others of the crew were saying, let's look to our own rich culture right here in America. Let's look at the blues, let's look at our folk tales, let's look at our lives. And so this quote underneath, this right to express our individual dark-skinned selves, really was kind of really a watershed moment in terms of what we know as the Harlem Renaissance, where this sort of breaking through energy of some of the younger artists gave it a whole different flavor. Some of that can be certainly evident in this particular piece. Again, the younger artists here put together a literary journal called Fire, where they express, again, their individual dark selves. You might recognize this art. This is by Aaron Douglas, who really changed his style during this period and became more interested, moved away from pretty landscapes and things, really doing art that was really strongly about his culture and its ancestral culture. Moving forward here, as we swing into Chicago, some people say the Chicago Renaissance is a bit of a misnomer because Margaret Burroughs has been known to say, well, we never stopped making art, we always have been making art. And so definitely one of those key figures of this this Chicago period. There's certainly a broader illustrious crew we'll talk about in a little bit. And she's also one of the driving forces behind the founding of the Southside Community Art Center. We also have Charles White, and I know that some of my colleagues are going to talk about him in a little bit more detail. And so I wanted to show you some of his earlier work from the mid-40s, this piece called Eight. And so if you look a little closer in the hand of this gentleman, you see him standing in front of a gate. And you notice in his palm, there's like a stigmata. So interesting idea that has often popped up is this idea linking the suffering of Jesus to the suffering of Black people in America. One might even dare he posit the idea of a Black Jesus or a Jesus with a Black physiognomy. So a lot to ponder here in early Charles White. This is one of many wonderful prints by Elizabeth Catlett. And this particular piece speaks to her movement in Mexico and her involvement with Mexican printmakers. And also this idea that, she, as many of you know, she's always a race woman. Her work was always, about uplift, liberation, edification. But she moved down into Mexico, her concerns expanded to not just the concerns of the Black people, but also the concerns of the Mexicans, her new countrymen. So that is the people down there, the political struggles and things often showed up in her work there. So as this piece here, just that right to be able to eat.
Thank you so much, Juarez. That was very enlightening. At the time, Margaret Burroughs and Charles Wright and Elizabeth Catlett were in Chicago, and they were described as having leftist leanings. Today we might call their views progressive. But at the time, they hadn't found a collective mode of expression to visually depict the protest of the treatment of Black people until they became familiar with the Mexican muralists. Luis, who were the Mexican muralists? What was their importance?
Hi, how are you today? First of all, the Mexican muralists were a school founded by three of the biggest artists probably worldwide at the time. Obviously, we all know them. It's Diego Rivera, Jose Clemente Orozco, and David Alfaro Siqueiros, who were just the driving force behind the utilization of imagery and art to expand people's knowledge and understanding of their reality. I want to say, first of all, for me personally, being able to, as a young child, witness and be a part of Jose Clemente Orozco's work just changes your outlook and kind of, I think we use the phrase worldview on our reality by just those images impressing on your spirit of how very rough the kind of institutionalism of the Mexican government was at that time, the institution of racism basically towards the minorities of the Mayan, the Mexica, the Oaxacans, and all the people who were laid down in poverty. And if we want, we can go. I want to go through my images real quick, and we can go through the kind of. I want to give a brief history of how this all came about. Speaking historically, I think we need to go back to the kind of violent conquista that happened, as we all see it, as the discovery of the New World that the Europeans claim to have discovered. And this first image is a kind of, the first image is kind of the idea of, first of all, this painting is by David Alfaro Siqueiros, La Tormenta de Cuauhtémoc, and it's basically talks about the torture of Cuauhtémoc, the last emperor of the Mexica, who we know as the Aztecs. There was a brutal turnover of the societies in Mexico, what the Mexicans call the Anahuac, or one world. This brutality just bled through every level of society. And here we have Cuauhtémoc being tortured, as David Alfaro Siqueiros represents, by having his feet burned, and historically, it's a historically correct image. That's exactly what they would do to the leaders, to give them, because they basically wanted their treasures. So this is how they came about it, and this is David Alfaro's representation of this historical event. And here we have the Revenge or Venganza de Cuauhtémoc. And this particular mural is in the Palacio of Bellas Artes in Mexico City, one of David Alfaro's first commissioned murals. By the way, he had just been released from jail for making protest art, and he received a commission from the government of Mexico to create this work, which is to me kind of hilarious. But here we have Gautama kind of coming back after being tortured and hung, and he's taking his revenge out on the conquistadores, as they call them themselves. So this fantastic image of a superhero built up in this European armor, but still with the dark skin, and his mecatle, which is the obsidian tipped sword, in his hands. So you see how these images, when I think it was probably 70%, 60 to 70% of the people in Mexico were not literate, could not read. So the muralists decided, well, we're going to do exactly what the Roman Catholic Church did, and we're going to take imagery, and that's how we're going to inform people. We're going to use this imagery and really grab people's attention of what our plight is and how we can change it. Tony, go ahead to the next. And this is of course one of Diego Rivera's works. Probably to me my favorite work. It's La Historia de Mexico, and this is just a small detail of this. And unfortunately, I got it a little bit smaller, but the whole mural expands throughout the Palacio Nacional, which is the Mexican White House or Capitol building in Mexico City, and he goes through the whole episodes and eras of Mexican history, including the discovering of the island of Tenochtitlan and the battles within the different nations in Mexico before the Europeans came. But this in particular image is about the clash with the Europeans as they tried to break away and get away from the European dominance before it was too late. And they fought a good fight, and he shows them here. And this again just gives you an example of how Diego Rivera was using these imageries to kind of reclaim the identity of Mexicans, of being not European, not for lack of better terms, indigenous, but this combination, and he gravitated towards the indigenous part. He made people proud of their backgrounds. He made people proud of their history, and that's exactly what his intentions were. This is probably one of my favorite pieces of works of any muralist. This is Jose Clemente Orozco, El Hombre en Fuego. It's located in Las Cabañas in Guadalajara, Mexico. And I had this is the piece that really influenced me early on in my early childhood. I would lay down on the floor and just gaze at these things for hours on end. No one can, my family couldn't drag me away. And if you look at this piece, it's a very bloody piece. And that's exactly what Jose Clemente Orozco wanted to convey. This is the ideas of the Mexican Revolution. This is the suffering that the Mexican people endured during that revolution. That whole time, over 1 million Mexicans were killed. So these artists really took it upon themselves to show the population this, to show the people this, and to affect their minds, to kind of relate to them that this is a bad thing. Obviously, no one wants to go through this very violent episode, and they wanted to educate people. We can have a different society. We don't have to do this. This is a bad path to follow. Jose Clemente Orozco, by the way, did live in New York City for a while, and he did come back to Mexico during the revolution to witness this brutality. Diego Rivera did not. Diego Rivera was in Europe all this time, working on his technique and working in his art. But David Figueros and Jose Clemente Orozco did live with this. Especially David Figueros. He was he actually was a combatant in these battles. So if you look at his work, it's very passionate, and he understood that idea of violence. They were fighting this revolution, and this is one of my favorite photographs. I took this at a very young age, but it's there. So these guys rose up. They didn't want to be oppressed by the dictatorships of Porfirio Diaz. So this is one of the Diego Rivera's kind of more peaceful imagery, and I wanted to start talking about the influence that the muralists had on African American artists. This is John Biggers, and if you can see the kind of relationship between how Diego Rivera's composition and John Biggers' work is in this, I think this is in a later work also. So you see the kind of formation and influence that he had gotten from the works of Diego Rivera. Another John Biggers work, which is very reminiscent of Diego Rivera's mural work in the sense of that he's putting everything on kind of a timeline that's kind of converging towards the center, towards one piece. And he's using a very muted palette, but very similar in composition to what he was influenced by by Diego Rivera. This is David Alfaro Siqueiros' work. This is again La Tormenta, and you see the figure, central figure, kind of breaking her chains free and kind of exploding off that wall. This is a very impressive piece. It's one of those pieces that kind of changes your life if you stand in front of this. It's just so amazing. This is one of my favorite drawings ever. Charles White, and have this figure. It has that feeling of just breaking free, and he even has dust in his hands flying, letting that dust free, kind of to me representing what we turn into. So I straight away seen the influence of Siqueiros' work on Charles White, which Charles White's works to me is just, again, amazing. You see it live, another life changer. Okay, so this is Jose Clemente Orozco, La Trinicia, the trench. And again, this is the idea of kind of a group escaping. And again, I think Juarez talked about the idea of Christ, and you see the central figure kind of being crucified there. So this whole scene to me kind of makes me think of people wanting to escape and have something to look upon that makes them feel better. But if we go to the next piece, which is it should be Romare Bearden. There we go. Romare Bearden's work, the Migration series. This is panel number 3 from the Migration series. And I know the palette is different. I know the figures are different. But this always made me think of the Orozco works, because there's something about the way he handled that whole series. Just made me feel like it was that idea of getting to a better place and getting something that's more than us. And this piece to me exemplifies that. The idea of this group of migrants, people, but trying to get to a different place, being led by, you see these stark black birds there. And I just, I always kind of had that connection between Orozco's work and this piece, or I'd say this series of work by Romare Bearden. I'm going to move on to a little bit to the Vietnam era. I just want to talk about the idea of works like this. Of course, one of my. All right, so this is painting by Ignacio Diaz. His work is speaking about one of my heroes, Cesar Chavez, who formed a movement to help the farm workers, migrant farm workers, kind of band together against very predatory work conditions and work employee, very predatory employees. Okay, that's right. All right, so this artist created this mural to kind of memorialize Cesar Chavez and all the workers that really took part in this movement. And we all, I think, remember the No Grapes movement. So this artist decided, well, I'm going to make sure that these people are remembered. Well, these are historical, real people that he put up on these walls to commemorate them and talk about their struggles. This is still one of my favorite artists, a Chicago-based artist. He passed away, Carlos Cortez, who himself protested the Vietnam War, and he decided to get away to draft what they call draft dodge, F8, and he was in prison for I believe 2 years. So this Carlos Cortez, he draft dodged. He was in F8 military terms, but he they imprisoned him up in Wisconsin for 2 years, and he didn't budge. He would not. He said he had no reason to go and fight. Just like Muhammad Ali said, that the Vietnamese people didn't do anything to him. Why am I mad at them? So he just said no. So he got thrown in jail. So he wound up turning to the arts and created these incredible woodcuts that he would do. Even to an elderly age, he just continued working. And this piece is called La Lucha. It is just talking about the idea of consistently fighting anything that pretty much that you don't want to follow, that you feel is consciously or wrong. So he believed in that. So I really appreciated his point of view, and I loved being able to get to know him a little bit and see what he was about. This is still one of my favorite. This is Jesse Trevino. If you go into San Antonio, Jesse Trevino is everywhere. His public work is everywhere. And he was a Vietnam vet. He went the other way. He's Mexican American, and instead of going to Mexico when he got his draft notice, he decided, well, I'm going to go ahead and commit myself and go to the fight. So he went to the fight, and he wound up getting shot up pretty bad. He does not have the use of his right hand, but somehow he manages to create these beautiful works that are, to me, amazing. If you go to San Antonio, you see them all over the place. And he talks about his experiences as a Mexican American and how they affected his life. You see the drugs there, the fast cars, his Purple Heart with being held by what he has on his right hand, the little claw. So to me, it's a very powerful way of kind of protesting. One of the most cleverest art campaigns I've ever come across. This is Esther Fernandez. And Esther really was powerful in kind of creating this campaign against the corporate farming conglomerates that took advantage of migrant workers by just taking their health for granted. Poisons, everything, pesticides that they had to deal with. She made it into this huge art campaign. And as you see, it's the Sun Mad Raisins instead of Sun Made, playing on those terms. So she really took this campaign to the next level, and I absolutely love these works. It kind of speaks for itself. If you look at it, you look at the play on everything. Just, to me, an amazing way of using imagery to get that point across.
I want to thank you for, I learned a lot. And it's great to see the influences between the Mexican artists and Black American artists. With Diego, with his political ideas and affiliations, did that oftentimes like not hinder his art, but did he get in trouble with some of the imagery?
You know, that's a great question, Paul. His political views were obviously very leftist, and you know, he really believed in the idea of communism. As a lot of people in that time really believed that communism was going to be a good thing. And it did get him in a lot of trouble, especially when he worked in the United States. The Rockefeller murals that he created in Rockefeller Plaza in New York were just they were just torn down. I mean, because he wanted to, and he did include images of Lenin, who was his idol. Lenin really influenced him. Lenin and Trotsky influenced him to think in that kind of political sense, which is very strange, because if you look at the big three's political affiliations, they're all very leftist. They're all very communist, but they follow different factions, which kind of split the three up into kind of a very adversarial ways. And it became violent too. It became physically violent, unfortunately.
I know during the 50s that there was a period where Charles White did political cartoons for the Daily Worker, which is a communist paper. By the government, and they felt their place within society. They leaned that way, and their art reflected that.
And speaking of political affiliations, Charles White was a very leftist, obviously leftist, communist thinking artist or person. So much so that he was not allowed back into the United States, and that's part of the reason him and Elizabeth Kaplan divorced, because he wanted to come back. Elizabeth Kaplan was not allowed in the United States, back into the United States for a long while because of her political affiliations. She would not denounce them. Yeah, so those things affect our lives personally. The idea, the whole political sensibilities. She was physically barred from coming back. So, and then she finally said, you know what? I'm not going to come back. I'm going to stay in Mexico.
I think that got a nice segue point. So before we move a little further in history, I'd like to circle back to that period we were talking about with the 30s and the 40s. Keeping in mind, what we're looking at is this time of, social realism in art. Of course, you're thinking about what's going on in America. We're still dealing with lynching and discrimination and lack of access and all this other stuff on top of it. And so the artwork, both in particularly Russia as well as America, is starting to take on this sense of sort of social responsibility and this kind of tell it like it is aesthetic. So it's populating both America, and it's trickling into the Black community as well. When we're looking at the WPA, part of what's happening with WPA artists is they're being commissioned to go out and kind of document what's going on. So while you have Dorothea Lange sort of documenting the Dust Bowl and workers, you have artists and writers. In particular, I'm thinking about Richard Wright, and he wrote a book, I believe it's called A Million Black Voices. And he and a photographer, they travel through like the American South, and they're just, documenting poverty in America, both from rural America as well as urban America. There was this dream of the Great Migration that if we left the South, everything's going to be milk and honey. But oftentimes, due to like the restrictive covenants and restrictions on where African Americans would live, they're often crammed into these tenements, several families in a one family unit. And so Richard Wright, artists, photographers like that, we're documenting those conditions. So it's becoming like the mood of the times. And Dr. Burroughs talks about that as well. It's like, we're just documenting the poverty around us. So if our paintings looked all hollow-eyed and, malnourished, it's because that's what we saw. That's what was out there. I like to pull up a slide, I think that sort of hits some of that. I'm gonna pull up one of my pieces. Okay, so here's one of the images I was talking about. It's 12 million Black voices, and let me move this little annoying little thing out of the way. So that's one of the images that you can see, you know, in that sense of just being, you know, too broke to have a window to throw it out of, so to speak. And this is the image I wanted to show. So of that period of time, because this is also where you're beginning to see the grassroots movement that led to the founding of the Southside Community Arts Center. Again, part of that WPA initiative, but largely spurred on by the efforts of Margaret Burroughs and basically the African American community to create a site where folks can show their work and hold classes and basically just have access to art and the means of showing it. So one of the artists that operated through the Southside Community Arts Center is Gordon Parks, and you guys know him from Shaft. But he also was really a very prolific photographer. He had a long history with as a fashion photographer. This image is really a very poignant one. This is documenting a woman named Ella who worked for the White House as a cleaning woman. And so you can see sort of the irony both in the position of this woman kind of, you know, against the backdrop of the American flag, as well as in the title. He's riffing off of that piece by Grant Wood, where, you know, the guy's holding the pitchfork, but here, you know, she's holding it down as both mother and father. Because part of what you see later in this series is that Ella is basically the sole caregiver for her family. So she's taking care of not only, you know, her daughter, but her daughter's children, and basically under like just the most wretched of conditions in the home of the free. Here's another piece by Gordon Parks. I want to just let that one float on the air. And, you know, because you guys have heard about the studies about preferences and those sorts of things. So I'm just going to let that one float on the air. And so moving back, as we talked about that sort of cross-pollination influence of these artists who traveled down to Mexico and studying printmaking among some of the masters down there, we see in Catlett's work, particularly this work here from the 40s, this is part of a body of prints that she did about the conditions of Black women. And so in each of them across the series, she's talking about issues of housing, tenements, urban slums, sharecroppers, and so on. So kind of like Richard Wright, but she's executing it through this series of prints. So like Luis was saying, you now have an image or a series of images that are not only affordable, but easy to disseminate and to get that word out. And here is the Southside Community Arts Center. Like I mentioned before, this really was a grassroots effort. And it also speaks to why the Chicago, dare we say, Renaissance, partly why it survived even after the Harlem Renaissance sort of faded, is because it relied not only on, you know, broader philanthropy, but also just the nickels and dimes of the communities. There's sort of the legend of the dime campaign where artists hung out on the corners and just collected dimes so that they were able to fund the center and you know, staff it and bring in teachers. And so it's one of, I think, probably the only remaining WPA Arts Center in existence. I think there were about 110 at its heyday. And we've just managed to raise, kind of in collaboration with the Chicago Printers Guild, again, speaking of printers, over $18,000 to renovate the center and allow it to continue moving on into perpetuity. And so, with that, you know, we were talking about sort of the period of the times. I imagine this, you know, we really moved from 30s to 40s. So there's our moderator. Where we were is, this is my moderator voice. During the 1960s,
Okay.
and well into 2020 protests, became the narrative to express disdain for being a victim of exclusion from the national messages. Can you describe how protest art became a message of for Black people, and messages about the Vietnam War, which some of which we've gotten, and hip hop and Colin Kaepernick and others before the depiction of the acts of terrorism perpetuated against George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement.
So let's talk about the 60s and the 70s and going on to now. We were just talking about this connection between art and politics. And I think this is a perfect example of that. This is an image by Emory Douglas, and who made all the images. If you're familiar with the Black Panther Party and their publications, a lot of that imagery came from Emory. And it was just, it was powerful. It was the printmaking technique made these pretty bold images, and along with the messaging that went along with it. When you get to the 70s, it was still going on, but in 73, the year I was born was the same year that hip hop had arrived. So hip hop wasn't just music; it was a combination of music, of art, of dance, and street art and graffiti became prevalent in urban areas. And outside of the braggadocious nature of the art form, there were a lot of messages that were carried along walls and subways. Gloria was speaking earlier about how artists basically spoke of their conditions. And it was the same in this art form as well. And you would see on streetcars in New York, in large letters and in bright colors, it would say stuff like, "All you see is crime in the city." And it was depicting this stark difference between where black and brown people lived and how clean and prissy Manhattan was at the time. So these images that we saw on walls, not just here in the US, but you're talking globally, where they started talking about, it was depicting the government as greedy. And it was just this conglomerate of just money. Everything was about money and not about people. So images like this, all the way down to F the police, all type of imagery were put on walls all across the world. So up until today, so all these images are going on, and this is recently. This is from 2020 by an artist named Marcus Jansen, and this was all about people wanting to take down these monuments and these statues that sort of romanticize the Confederate flags and the South. This artist did like an entire series of these works, and if you have a chance, look them up because they're extremely powerful, very poignant. So even before Floyd and everything that happened this year, it's just been a culmination of events and artists react to it. This is a painting by Charlie Palmer, he's down in Georgia, but I think he grew up in Milwaukee, and he did spend time here in Chicago. I think he did undergrad here in Chicago. And his imagery is, I would put a lot of this imagery as part of, as protest art. And it's basically, it's always been poets and painters that have been at the forefront of speaking out. This is Charlie Palmer. That's the name of this artist here. This is also Charlie Palmer. This was in response to Trump's first campaign, and what did Make America Great Again? What did that mean? Very powerful stuff. Imagery is extremely powerful. This next slide here, it just wasn't painters, but it was photographers. If you remember when Baltimore was burning a few years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, and there were riots every night, I was on Instagram and I was following a photographer named Devin Allen. So outside, he was out in the streets every day with his camera, recording and documenting. This particular image that Devin captured, and he was a young photographer, young brother from the Baltimore area. These images that are captured, this image actually became the cover of Time Life magazine in 2015. So it's always the artists that are speaking out, that are documenting, whether it's through photography, whether it's through painting or drawings. And we talked earlier about how it's important for images to speak truth. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry, go back. We'll talk about that later. But these are some of the images that, from the Vietnam War up until now, they spoke out against terrorists and just within this country, everything that's been going on.
How has the mural experience influenced art in Chicago today? What current projects of murals as public art do you know of? Do you believe public art projects serve as mediums of inclusion for the public?
I want to show you guys a couple of images. Very important mural that was done this summer. If you all can think about what the atmosphere was like in June, not just between African Americans and police, but here in Chicago, 1 week there was, whether it was real or fabricated, there became some tension between black and brown people. And most of that was via the internet, via the media. In the midst of that, this mural was done. It's on 79th Street. It's like a block east of Stony Island. And it was a mixture of black and brown artists that did this mural that came together. It was, some people in here know Static, Max Sansing, Scent Rock, Tubbs, Cujo. These are artists that do a lot of murals around the city. And some of their street art spills over into fine art. In the case of Max Sansing, in the case of Static, he has pieces out on the street and in galleries. This was basically the point of this mural, was to show love and pride between black and brown people. That slide is for our next discussion, which talks about the importance of what artists are we looking at right now and their importance.
As far as we're talking about the idea of, and I love Paul's point of unity in this kind of fabricated, and I love that you use that term, fabricated division between our communities. I really think that's the exact point of our political powers that be, whatever party you're from, is kind of divide using this fabricated ideas. And it's great to see that, first of all, that this panel discussion has taken place, and we talked about it, Sandra and I talked about it on our phone call, that it's very important that we kind of connect our communities and involve in constantly, as opposed to saying they're separate communities, that we become a community that respect each other's culture and aspects of our realities. which I think is great. I also think that in the art world, we've become very powerful in the sense that we can now go to the streets and see our murals all over Pilsen, all over the South Side. You see, Calvin Johnson's murals all over when they're still around, and people who are working very like Static, who I absolutely love his work. So it's very important to see being more involved in our community and making it a bigger community.
Can you make us aware of artists in Chicago who are making their mark in redefining who we are as a people and as who we are as part of the national identity?
There are a few people that I do want to discuss. One is an artist that he's from Chicago, he no longer lives in Chicago, and that's Kevin Williams. And I can't speak enough about this brother. Not only the images that he creates, but also the knowledge that he passes on to other Black artists. And this is one of his latest pieces that speaks directly to what has been happening this summer. This is also on 79th Street. This is a Max Sandstein piece, and we were talking about how creating imagery, and it's very important, this imagery is in our own communities, and how we see ourselves, and at this scale, you can't help but stop and take notice of it. Other artists that I think would fall into this category, this question that you asked, would be Roger Carter. On an abstract level, Amanda Williams, with her continued conversation about Blackness and what is Blackness, and that we're not a monolithic culture. Mm-hmm. So it's just this broad range of who we are and how we express ourselves. And going back to Margaret Burroughs earlier when we were talking about that, first and foremost, she was a teacher. And when you have those many young minds in front of you, and you're constantly, not just with words, but with imagery, you're stating that we are people and we matter. We don't let other people define who you are. Not from Chicago, but if you're in Chicago right now, there's a dynamic exhibition at the Visa Butler at the Art Institute. This is another artist that creates imagery that defines how beautiful Black people are.
What I'm going to touch on are some of those artists that are continuing the fight, if you will. You guys have heard of this controversy a few years back with Dred Scott and his whole controversy as to how to properly display an American flag. This was one that really, I think he was a student at the School of the Art Institute at the time. And this really just generated a lot of controversy. And I think it's really timely for now because of this idea of, this whole patriotism, the Patriot Act, and we're kind of coming back into what this flag is standing for. So, this was a couple decades back, but still really very timely. And he's still doing very interesting work on race. Equally so is Dawoud Bey. Some of his more current projects include the Birmingham Project. And in this piece, this body of photographs, he's meditating on the church bombing in Birmingham that killed those 4 little girls. And so what he's done is he's given us profiles of the photo on the left is a young lady who would have been the same age as one of the children that were killed. And then the image here on the right represents it had that child been allowed to grow into maturity, she'd be about this age. So kind of reminding us that that story is about human lives and kind of putting a face on that tragedy. Paul talked about Amanda Williams. She's certainly doing some very, very interesting things. Probably one of the projects that really put her on the international map was the Colored Theory Project, as basically a critique on the lack of housing stock, particularly in communities of color. And what she did through here is kind of stealthily in the middle of the night in some cases, got painting crews to go out and paint these abandoned homes. And they painted them in colors that were significant to African American culture, like Afro Sheen Blue, Harold's Chicken Shack Red, and so on. So it was really a project that really got her a lot of media attention, and she's continued to do work that's examined ideas of racial profiling and, again, access. One artist that I enjoy is here at the School of the Art Institute. This is Jefferson Pender. And he's an artist that works across multiple disciplines, from installation to sculpture to video, and ever always exploring ideas of race. So here's one called Assimilated. So it's neon, and at his feet is a pile of coal. And I'll let you all chew on that one. Another one here from that same exhibition is Gauntlet. And so what you have here are just a lot of billy clubs strung from the ceiling. And so when you walk into the space to actually walk in under it, it's really very eerie. It's like meant to give the viewer a sense of what it might be like, say, to be a Rodney King or to be an African American male dealing with, this police violence. So he's putting it in really very stark relief in this installation. Many of you know Joyce Owens, and you know that Joyce is perennially on that quest to dismantle racism in her work. This is one of her more strident pieces, Medieval in America. Again, sort of highlighting just how vulnerable Black lives were throughout our history and even today. This is Garland Martin Taylor. Forgive the type flipping over there. This is one of his more recent pieces, and it's a huge gun, and it's emblazoned both with faces, again, giving a human face to gun violence, but also there are like a number of names sort of inscribed in the metal outlining the names of people who've been lost to violence, a number of particularly young people that we've lost too soon. So he's traveled around the country with this one to raise awareness and have conversations about what's going on. We have Krista, back up. We have Krista Franklin, who's really getting a lot of attention with her new book, Too Much Midnight. And a good chunk of both her poetry and her imagery, she's a collage artist and really pulls a lot of images from our culture. I mean, it's almost like a walking tour of Ebony and Jet magazine sometimes to look at her work. So here she's juxtaposing those Ravine en Naturel as, I believe that might have been Richard Roundtree, with the image of beauty sort of propagated by Elizabeth Taylor. So she gives us really a lot of, we can argue she's a postmodernist, so certainly giving us a lot of these really rich images from our history and culture. And jumping ahead of myself here, we also have Kerry James Marshall on the heels of a magnificent retrospective here in Chicago. And I love this image because it really speaks to his love of history and historical painting, and this idea of really rearranging, reconstructing the narrative. So here, what's being depicted here is Harriet Tubman. So kind of coming but supplementing the images we normally see of her as the soldier and the scarf around her neck and, holding a rifle or whatever. You're showing a more tender side of her with her first husband, John Tubman. And so you not only have, again, redefining the narrative, showing that, in addition to all the things she's also still a woman, but also here too, really very sly, very political move put in here, particularly with this black glove. It's a reference to the image at the Olympics. They're talking about it now on Bounce, where the athletes did the Black Power salute and eventually had their medal stripped for just daring to express, African American identity on an Olympic podium. So that black glove is just that little hint that, of that, just again, tying in these layers of history. We've got Fahim Majin, speaking of history. I particularly like this piece here as part of his ongoing floating museum collaborations that he's working on, this idea of making the museum a much more democratic institution. And here, this was installed in front of the Historical Society. This was a huge inflatable that he eventually had like floating over Inglewood and different parts of the city. And it's depicting Harold Washington, I believe, Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable, and a little fun fact I wasn't aware of, a Native American woman named Kitawa, who was actually his wife. So speaking to, again, that cross-cultural collaboration, and part of the way he was able to really make it as a trader and a trapper is to be able to interact with people in a much more meaningful way rather than just being about, here, let me take all your land and territory. He actually was a trader and really fostered real relationships with the native population around him. And so I'm going to close just on this last one, for my little segment, with Kerry James Marshall. And this was a painting that was eventually made into prints. And it speaks to a very sort of Afrofuturist theme. We didn't really touch on that much, but Afrofuturism dealing with this notion of us creating a vision for how we want to live, for the kind of society we want to exist in. And so this is really, you can see outside the window, there's like the Milky Way or the comet or whatever, but inside this futuristic home, even though the kids are like watching, the hologram, kind of irrelevant with all the homeschooling going on these days. But this futuristic home is still really rich with culture, down from the clothes and the kuba cloth, the statuary, and so on. So that idea that in, this world he wants to create, we're keeping that culture alive.
The artist that I really see making kind of impact on art itself in Mexico and in Chicago, in the United States, I think of three of them. First of all, it's this is probably to me one of the most impactful artists today. He uses these images and patterns to present his work. He's a little bit older now, but he's a really energetic guy. He's churning out paintings like mad. I love his work, and I think he's probably one of the most influential. The next guy I want to talk about is Damiano Ortega from Oaxaca. He's a Oaxacan artist, and he's using kind of infusion of the Zapotec culture and contemporary kind of language that he's making up. And I really suggest that if you guys want to look at his work, his name is Damiano Ortega, and just a very powerful artist. He's really, for me, in kind of intermixing the indigenous, his heritage into the contemporary. Really beautiful work, and he's not a muralist, but I think he really does a good job at putting his imagery out there. Okay, so our last guy is a Chicago artist who, in the past few years, has really done some amazing work. His name is Pablo Serrano, and I really like the way he's approaching his work. He's really taken the Mexican muralist movement into his own, and you can see his work all over the building. He's doing some good projects right now, and a really good guy. And I love the way he's using his abilities to continue on the Mexican tradition. The first artist is Alfredo Arguin.
Okay.
There it is up on the screen. Yeah, he's out of Seattle.
Okay.
Really a great example of an artist who's got so much energy.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, I see there's just a lot of wonderful commentary appearing in the comment section. So let's transition and let's open it up for any questions from our participants. If you have something you'd like to ask, raise your hand and I'll call on you and you can ask your question. Okay, Patrick McCoy, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to ask the question earlier about the political cartoons. They were very, very big in the 19th and the 20th century, and I was wondering why you didn't bring them up, because they were in the forefront of political protest.
We didn't think about it. We were wrapped up in
Juarez, could you be very candid and honest about that comment?
Well, no, it's really, in the idea that what we touch really does just scratch the surface of test. But I think you're dead on the money. I mean, if ever you want to see what's going on in the world, you look in this sort of that political cartoon section of the paper.
And Stephen Jones has done some serious research on that. Stephen Jones in Philadelphia, and he was showing, and also Garland Taylor, that in the 19th century, Black people were really utilizing that technique to get across protests, political cartoons. I wanted to ask another question. It didn't seem to get clear to me that so many of the artists, I mean, the list is just super long. Black artists went to Mexico to study printmaking, and also to look at the murals, and that had just a dramatic effect when they came back, or the work came back from Mexico to the subsequent decades, the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s, and I wanted it to be made clear that they went there because the political freedom that the leftist government in Mexico was providing, that was in short supply here in the United States because of depression and the rise of fascism and all that other stuff.
That's so true, Patrick. And we always talk about this with the coming to power of Lázaro Cárdenas, who was a very leftist leader. The artistic movement there in Mexico really blossomed. It didn't have the restrictions that the United States has, for all its intent and glory that the United States is the freest country. It really restricted artists in the sense of what they could put up there on their murals, as we see in Diego Rivera's example. That's just one example. And that also, blatant racism in the United States took a toll on large swaths of our communities, Black, Mexican. It was a very harsh thing that really pushed our community down. So to go to a place where you're welcome, and it didn't matter the color of your skin, we're all equal people at that point. It changed the whole creative feeling. It really does make you feel.
Elizabeth Catlett spoke to that as part of her transition to becoming a Mexican citizen, in saying that racism wasn't the issue she was dealing with down there. Maybe, again, that idea of being an outsider, but racism was not a concern, and she was able to go on and teach and raise a family and basically live. During particularly, well, she went down much later, but we have to, let's not forget the impact of the McCarthy era, and particularly, how those artists who were even mildly interested in communism or socialism were being blackballed and blacklisted, across the whole creative field, actors, composers, musicians. Why wouldn't some people want to leave?
That's so true, Juarez. And speaking of Elizabeth Catlett, that was one of the things Paul and I were talking about. She was not allowed back into the United States because she would not denounce the idea of communism. So she just said, you know what, I'm going to stay here. I'm going to make my life here. And that's exactly what she did. Even after they said she could come back in.
And she did come back to visit briefly. She did make a quick stop at the Southside Community Arts Center. Don't quote me on the year.
Yeah, I do. I think we talked about this, and which was I knew about that, but it was kind of funny that not a lot of people really realized that she did come in to Chicago. I believe she went to. I don't think it was New York. It was I forgot where else to visit for a while, but she wasn't really happy there either. So back to Mexico, she went.
Can't say I blame her.
Not at all.
When she attended the South Side, the next day she was over at the National Mexican Museum and had a great turnout.
Oh, that's right. Right, I remember that. It was a mob in there.
Yes, exactly.
It was I don't think there was room to get in for a while. I remember seeing that and being like, kind of being like, oh, I don't know if I can make it in. But the one thing that that I don't know if a lot of people know is that realize that Charles White and Elizabeth Catlett, when they were down there, they really first went down there not only for the political situation, but Charles White was not well physically due to the injuries he received in the war. So he needed a better climate to be in, and they thought, well, this is not much better than this. So after they wound up splitting up, I think he wound up in Los Angeles to be in a better place for his physical health.
Do you have any other questions from our participants? Okay.
Oh, well, I wanted to ask a question to of Luis concerning the murals that were in Mexico during the 30s. They were done for internal spaces. Am I correct? They were not done on the outside of buildings like we see today.
Oh, you know what, Patrick? They were done on outside of spaces. A lot of them were done in exterior. So when I read your question, I think I read it wrong, but yeah, a lot of them are done in exterior. Like the Diego Rivera's mural at the Palacio Nacional. That's actually on the exterior. It's not inside the courtyard, but it's exterior, and it goes all throughout that inside. David Alfaro Siqueiros covered a whole side of an exterior building. I think it's a 27-story with a painted and a mosaic mural.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, one of the reasons why we decided to put this panel together is because Sandra wrote a blog about 100 years of protest. And it got me to thinking as I'm driving through our community, I see the murals, but you don't really see them. You're not paying them any attention. And because of what she wrote, it just brought me to an awareness that this is something important that should not be missed and that we really should pay attention and draw attention to. And that's why we reached out to Juarez, Lewis, and Paul to highlight, as wonderfully they've done this afternoon, to give us some perspective from whence these things come so we can appreciate them going forward. I also recognize the wonderful comments that people were bringing in the discussion that was happening that lets me know that this is resonating and that needs to go on and go forward. I want to take this opportunity to thank the panelists, to thank Sandra and especially Tony for putting this together, and to thank Diaspora Rhythms for their sponsorship and support of this platform, and hopefully you'll tune into our next iteration where we'll be looking at the Haitian art and how that is expanding and growing. So I want to take this opportunity to thank you for taking some time out of your busy day. If you like, there's more information about this, and Tony will show that on the screen. There's some wonderful photo images of protest art. And with that, I wish you all happy holidays. Thank you so much. Stay safe, stay warm, stay wonderful, stay loving, and keep collecting. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Dee.
Thank you, Dee.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you to everyone.